Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Kristin Barbato, who's been involved. She is so sought after that utilities, governments, and companies hire her company, Build Edison, is that the name? Uh, Build Edison. She was formerly, were you the chief energy manager for New York City or just in that division? You teach classes at Columbia and NYU, graduate level classes, and you're here to tell us about scaling innovation in clean energy.
Yeah. Thank you
Please.
so much for having me today, Tom. It's great to see you again. Peter, once again, great to be back. And I'm so glad that you are carrying the torch for the 20th year for this this great event. Thank you. So Tom, as you mentioned, yes, I've had a kind of a broad career in working both for utilities, for government, and in private sector. And throughout that career, I've had a very interesting thread of developing and integrating innovative energy solutions into the market, into the infrastructure. So what I found is through all of that is that there's a few ways that we think about scaling and some components that are really helpful to making sure that actually can happen. And this, I'm sure we're thinking about this audience today, the investors, as well as some of the clean tech companies that we're talking to. You're always looking about how are you going to scale this solution. So in energy, it's not always the easiest thing to do. But there are some things that I've learned, and that's really been a basis of many of the programs I've developed over the years. So the idea behind scaling is how and why do we scale? So there's obviously lots of policies that are very favorable in New York and in other places to enable some of those goals to be achieved, but it's really market adoption and having technology ready and tested to be able to integrate that for that market adoption to even happen. So Tom, I could go into a little bit about what makes some of the components of scaling that are important that I've found to like demonstration projects, if that's something that's of interest to you.
Well, I'd love to hear more about what you do for your clients.
Yeah, sure. So that actually that works in really well. So we think about scaling in terms of many different areas. One is of course market development. Another is product development and how that can scale and what your technology and solution roadmap looks like. But also a big component of that is demonstration projects. So a lot of times you need to think about your scaling from a starting point. Too often, I think the demonstration projects that we've done in the energy industry have been almost endpoints, and we like to think about them much more as starting points. So we think about a demonstration or a pilot, we kind of use those terms interchangeably, even though they're not, they're different, but depending upon the definition that you like. The successful demonstration has some components that enable that demonstration to be the beginning part of a larger deployment. So when we work with clients that are big and small. We work with clients that are state governments, large corporate strategics, investors and developers, as well as clean tech companies. And the thread between those that's the similar is that they have vested interest in a technology or solution and how to get that put into the market for market adoption and integrated.
Do you have examples of the technologies or programs? Because I imagine the utilities are looking at it differently.
Yes.
They're looking for programs to be implemented, whereas companies might say, no, we have a technology. So what have you been dealing with?
Yeah, it's different. My background is actually developing and running programs for both governments and corporations, because there are programmatics and utilities have programs as well. And big companies have programs. They might call them much more like a campaign. That's a very, very marketing technical jargon, but you think about it in some of the same ways as repeated events that can help them scale their of a programmatic nature, how they scale their solutions into the market. From the clean tech perspective, they're thinking much more about how do they enable their solution to be able to be part of that type of growth. So from the other end of the spectrum, we look at the demonstration as what is necessary for scaling. So whether it's a large corporate strategic or a clean tech company, if you've got a new solution and you want to scale it, a lot of times demonstrations are used as technical validation. And what's the technical risk? But I think a successful demonstration, going back to that concept, is it's necessary to enable a demonstration as a starting point for a bigger business case. And that would integrate metrics around operational risk, not just technical risk, also financial, not just financial risk, but what are the finances there and how do you gain economies of scale? And also social impacts. So when we think about working with clients, either big or small, in order to enable the scaling of a solution, if you're starting out with either a demonstration or an initial project with a larger client or whoever it might be, you want to think about that demonstration about as actually having metrics of success that are beyond just the technical risk. So, I'm thinking about things like from the operational perspective, if you're working with the utility, what does that actually mean? What are some of the hoops you have to go through from permitting? If you're connected to a building, what kinds of building infrastructure do you have to integrate with? And a lot of times what that means for clean tech startups is, what does the process look like? So instead of just being maybe a team of people that is all of whom are all hands on deck looking at a project for deployment, then what do all of these different functions mean? So you're actually thinking about this as a larger process that can then be scaled.
I see. So are a lot of your projects in smart grid?
Great question. Yeah. So the projects that we work on deal with, you can see, I like to say it like, if you drew a circle around the customer's meter and you see what that touches. Of course, you've got smart grid from the distribution side. So we work mostly on distribution level technologies from the utility and grid side. And then on the other side for the customer, we work in anything that we call X to grid. So building to grid, vehicles to grid, renewables, storage, and those are the types of solutions that we work within. So you can see that a lot of the companies that we work with will be grid edge and are talking to or either working directly with the utilities, not just the end users, which can be something that is not so easy to navigate.
Yes. So here are two questions. One, do we need a lot more distribution to power all the EVs? So that's you read about this in the papers. There's going to be a lot of EVs. The grid can't support it. What are your utility clients actually thinking in terms of?
Yeah, I would say for electric vehicle, we're thinking, I think from the utility standpoint, they're thinking about it from a few different perspectives. Not only is it infrastructure for the distribution grid, but it's also logistics. So when you have nodes or points or areas within your grid that are all of a sudden getting much more usage, much more drawdown of electrons at certain times, those peaks were not necessarily already accounted for in the design and management of the grid. And that's changing the face of how that grid will operate. So it's not just more infrastructure. I think it's understanding the logistics and operations and how to balance load. So EVs are not just drawing load, but they can also act as batteries. So how can some of that load be aggregated back into the grid as well? So I think that that's one of the aspects of or challenges that utilities are facing when looking at big EV rollout.
So is vehicle to grid one of these fairy tales that we tell stories about, but don't actually exist in real life? So are there?
I think it depends upon where you are. So
Is there any EV now that can discharge into the grid?
Well, through charging stations, yes, you can do that. So you can. I mean, yeah. There's several, and I don't want. I appreciate the question. We could go down a rabbit hole of all kinds of EV questions. There's a company that we work with that actually does plug-in and wireless, and within their solution. And there's so many opportunities for grid vehicle to grid. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're plugging straight into the utility. I mean, I don't do that at my house. I don't think you do either.
No.
But the concept is, how do we enable that to be aggregated or to be enabled? So the logistics of that. And that's not necessarily, and so getting back to a little bit to the concept of scaling, we can talk about scaling some of these solutions, especially for EVs, especially for charging stations, and how we're thinking about grid solutions that can be scaled. But I wanted to just for a moment, get back to this concept of what makes a good scalable demonstration project. So thinking about, for example, you could use it with EVs or building infrastructure, really defining what those metrics are for those different areas of risk, so that you're getting back, you're getting to what is developing the business case. Many times when you're doing some sort of demonstration or pilot project, the economics are knowingly not going to be there as appealing for that one project as it could be once they are deployed at more scale. But those are some of the things that you need to test out when you're doing this, and have some of those metrics that you're aiming for, so that you can have the next stage of deployment already teed up, and then you're testing against that kind of those kinds of metrics. So from an operational, technical, financial, social, you really want to be able to think about what that, I mean, this is really where we're thinking about the valley of death, right? So when you've got these capital intense projects that need to effectively have some kind of scalability in order to have, to pencil out and to then be profitable, where can you make a case for these economies of scale? This in the demonstration project is where you're starting to kick the tires on those things too, not just the technical. So I'm think of these as, whether it's EV charging stations, whether it's building IoT, whether it's storage beyond just the EV, but storage solutions, and also other types of grid technologies. You're thinking about them in terms of what is the first, second, and third levels of deployment, and then that can be repeated, and you get some sort of economy of scale with that as well.
So for the people listening today,
Mm-hmm.
what type of clients, who should contact you about doing business with Build Edison?
Sure. So we help, like I said, we work with large companies that are big corporate, like strategics, as you might think about them in terms of, they may have a technology solution or are seeking technologies
This
that
is
can
not,
then.
because I thought of you, maybe it's because of the name of the company, that like you had the in with the utilities. You were dealing with utilities and distribution and smart grid stuff. You're saying you'll also work with innovative technologies that are looking to get demonstration projects done, or whether they're with a utility or not. Is that, despite knowing you for many years, I'm still trying to figure out Build Edison's core business.
We're consultants.
You're consultants too, but you want to be a
So
consultant.
let me go into a little bit about, to answer your question. So the kinds of clients that we have are, they're basically two types.
Mhm.
One is the clean tech company, that's a small company that has a solution that's trying to navigate how they build their company and their market presence through what are probably their primary end users, like utilities, governments, or large real estate owners. So if you go back to that, taking a circle around the electric meter and looking at those solutions, who do they sell to? They sell to the customers on the big end of that. So it's big real estate or government or big, large energy consumers. And they also are probably working with the utility. So those are the kinds of companies that we work with, companies that have those types of solutions.
And you work with them
on the other end of the spectrum. Let me just finish this thought. The other types of clients that we have are those that are the bigger clients that actually are trying to engage with understanding what technologies are out there. How do they vet these technologies? How do they use them within their infrastructure? Or do they invest in them themselves?
Well, hopefully the environment is working in your favor. It sure seems like it. This is compared to 5 or 8 years ago. Is that accurate? Are you seeing more inquiry both ways? Because it sounds like you're bridging big companies to small companies and vice versa.
And vice versa. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So since I've had the experience in working in both smaller companies and very large companies, and been kind of like a buyer of many different energy solutions over the years that have been within building infrastructure, vehicle infrastructure, or I'll say transportation is probably more accurate. And then also smart grid and utilities infrastructure. You wind up being in the middle of this for a long time, and you're working, you can see both sides. So of what the needs are for the big companies and government portfolio owners, as well as the needs of the companies and what makes them successful to be able to work with them.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of questions that have
Great.
come in, some of which you might be able to answer on the side, but the one amusing one, so it's being aimed at you rather than the fellow from Constellation, about what's the biggest obstacle in New Jersey are utilities. How can we overcome this? You have 2 hours to answer.
Yeah, right. I might need more. So.
Are you seeing a change in the way utilities respond
Oh
to
yeah.
ideas?
Oh yeah. They realize that the landscape is changing. They are subject to the same types of policies and goals, and they have regulators that are enforcing different types of rules upon them as well. So they are changing. In fact, it was just last week I was speaking to someone who was starting up a new department within Con Edison. So, and that's not something that was done a long time ago. It was very staid. It was very like, here's where we do things. But all the time they're thinking about how to react to the market. It doesn't mean it makes it any easier for them to move quickly in enabling and integrating solutions, because they still have their risk profile is much more conservative, because they have these obligations to serve reliability. And like a former CEO of Con Edison used to say, we're not making raspberry lollipops over here. This is electrons that we're dealing with. It's dangerous stuff. So, but I would say it's not the easiest thing in the world to sell to or work within a utility infrastructure from the utility side or from the solution provider side. However, it is becoming more and more necessary, and I think that utilities are responding well to this, but there's room for growth.